Hi hobby friends, let's talk about fun. You know, I've been doing a lot of tricksy stuff lately. Look at the videos on my channel and that gives you an idea of basically all I've been doing. It's all about the techniques and tricks you can use to speed through minis or develop interesting results with minimal fuss. And that's cool, I'm enjoying doing that. But last week was a pretty full-on week, and the thought of coming to my desk at the end of the day to grind out edge highlights on a squad of underpainting experiments, well, let's say it wasn't filling me with the same excitement that it might on any other week. At the same time, I've had this bust sitting on my shelf for what feels like a million years. It was a whim purchase, a promise to myself that I'd take some time to get back to basics and really spend some time with a mini, learn something new about the fundamentals, that sort of thing. Then I decided I wanted to start an orc army. I got a mountain of Kriegsmen on commission, I was flooded with beautiful new Eldar models from GW. Well, you know the story. Our mournful fantasy chap here slowly slid to the back of the shelf until he was all but eclipsed by 32mm scale sci-fi belligerents. But last week, all of a sudden, he was exactly what I needed. So let's just chill out and paint a bust, shall we? He had the lighting sketch I threw down on him when he first arrived, but other than that, this will be simple acrylics and paintbrushes throughout. No tricks or expensive equipment involved. Let's talk about that lighting sketch quickly while I carry on blocking in his jerkin. What really drew me to this bust when I was scrolling about the internet was how simple but expressive he is. He's from a maker called Titan Trolls Miniatures, and apparently he's a Firbolg, but I didn't know either of those things when I clicked the add to basket on Etsy. It was just a mournful looking fantasy bust, something a little different to the usual heroic or, let's say, buxom offerings you can find, and I thought he'd be interesting to paint. He had a story to tell me, and that is absolutely the most important thing when selecting a fun project, I think. Do you want to tell this character's story? That idea of narrative is what will inform this whole process, to be honest. From big stuff like that initial lighting, which was developed from a nascent idea that perhaps what's making our poor friend here look so sad is the witnessing of his forest burning, and all the way to the littlest tiny stuff like the rough, jagged way I'm applying highlights to his jacket. I'm trying to tell the story of old leather with the brush. On a slightly more technical note, I've made sure to work with cool browns on one side and warm browns on the other. All this really means is selecting the right brown, or, as I did, adding a little bit of blue for one side and a little bit of orangey brown to the other. Warhammer style painting usually tells us to block in colours depending on their material, so all the red armour gets the same shade of red, for example, and then you build your highlights and shadows from there. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but on this larger piece where I want depth and movement from the get-go, I'm working my lighting straight into it from the first brush stroke. That's true for his hair too. Looking through Firbolg references, I settled on the strong contrast of some rich red locks to play against his blue skin. But I was hoping to explore a little of what it means to have blue light on red things and red light on blue things. His cool side is supposed to be moonlit, a tone that, at least in fantasy lighting, should help bring out the cool blue of his skin. That same light interacting with the red, however, will have the opposite effect, draining the red of some of its vibrancy and moving it toward brown. In the most extreme and, frankly, more realistic case, moonlight will draw out almost all the colour from an object, but we're painting a blue giant sheep man, so let's not get carried away with realism unnecessarily. The last thing I did on day one was start on the eyes. Again, there was a technical and narrative reason for this. On the technical side, by starting with the eyes, you give yourself plenty of opportunity to adjust as the piece develops and to fix any overspill when you come to work on the skin around the eyes. Tackling the eyes early on is also a good idea from the artsy side of painting too. The eyes on a figure of this size will always be the first place the viewer goes. They are the first and last storytellers for our tale, and as such, laying them in early should help us hone in on our protagonist and his mood. Unfortunately, all I got of the eye painting was this off-white base, so the deep dive on eye painting will have to wait for another day. Speaking of another day, the file name tells me that this was day 2 of our Firbolg adventure. Time to take a look at his skin. Or, well, I say skin, but actually I had in mind the kind of coarse, shallow fur you find on, say, a sheep's face. After a small and failed detour into attempted tricksiness with this stiff dry brushing approach, I went back to my good old size 2 round brush and decided to let the paint do the talking. I'm starting on the shoulder so I can do a little low-stakes exploring before I head on to the more important face, and you'll see 4 different kinds of blue on the palette there too. I mean, sure, you could just do one dark blue and keep adding white to build to your highlights, but the real world is so much more nuanced than that. Even on this, the cool side of our Firbolg friend, we need warmer tones to interact with the cooler ones, darker tones to interact with the lighter ones, broader and rougher brushstrokes to interact with the finer, detailed work. This is the sort of nuance and detail that will really lift the final piece, and it doesn't take much more work to do it either. Make sure the palette is full of options so you don't have to stop or think, keep the brush moving, and don't sweat the so-called mistakes. Looking back at the footage, I noticed I glazed in some pink on that nose and in the ears at some point off camera as well, so sorry for missing that, but we'll get plenty of nose action later, so no problem. The last thing of note for day 2 was sketching in this shadow here. I did it in nearly pure black, just thinned out a little bit with water. This is trying to emulate the dark border you often see between 2 sources of light on a 3D object. It's a shadow that occurs because of the angle of the 2 lights, but it's a great detail to put in when working with extreme dual source environmental lighting like this, or when doing OSL. It might not look like much now, but it's acting as a sort of visual note on the model for when I start working on the slightly intimidating fire-lit side. Before we do that, a pause to say a heartfelt thank you to the latest friend to join the patrons for this channel. Rook, you're a star. Thank you for your support. Day 3, and time to be a big boy and tackle the harder bit. Again, the palette is all laid out with a variety of blues and now a variety from the yellow to magenta portion of the spectrum, and after a little hand calibration work filling in some of the shadows and what have you, I start making some bold choices. I think it can be a good idea to work at a little distance when sketching in this kind of thing. Unlike a mini, busts like this are only really meant to be seen from one angle and at a slight distance, so hunching over the model with a magnifying glass is more likely to cause stress than add anything to the final piece. That really was almost all of day 3, just going back and forth on this fire-lit look, adding, taking away, futzing and futzing, but trying to avoid worrying or stressing over anything. I paint these little plastic things because it's relaxing. I do want them to be good, but to achieve that I better be as chilled out and carefree as I can. That's where the real magic happens with mini painting. Speaking of fun, how about mixing up some pink and tickling that schnoz a bit more? What a pleasure. Day 4 now, and at a guess I'd say we're about 4 or 5 hours into this guy now. I've got no particular goals or deadlines, but I would like to get him done before the weekend if I can, so let's see what we can do. I start with sculpting the face a bit more, thinking about my global lighting. That means things like the highest high on the cheek should be slightly darker than the highest high on the forehead. And I need to push that ear back a little, but ultimately it all comes down to more futzing, more fiddling, more glazes and fixes and fun. He's starting to look like something now. Here's a little trick I picked up from the phenomenal Sergio Calvo. Outlining. Having a dark border between elements almost always looks better than not having it. Whether it's because our eyes are trained for an illustrational look or because real-life things often have shadowy creases between them, I don't know. But so long as you keep it relatively subtle, it will add real definition to just about anything. Okay. After the last few fiddles and adjustments, let's see how this guy turned out. yeah, I'm happy enough with that. I love the organicness of his big pink nose, the texture in his furry skin, and the push and pull of different levels of detail between the sketched-in jerkin and the more focused face. I wish I could have gotten a bit more texture and life into his hair, and despite all the time I spent, there are still issues with the value contrast between his warm and cool halves. But I like him. He has a story to tell, and he was a welcome harbour I could duck into occasionally in what was at times a bit of a rough week. With the help of a Discord friend, I think I've settled on the name Bronach Tetherbranch. Thanks, Bronach. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. And thank you for watching this slightly less focused video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.